I'll never forget that first night when I felt the darkness behind the door watching me. I don't know if I'd still be breathing today if I had taken that step back, because what was looking at me in that moment wasn't human. And the most dangerous part of this story was that Selena Gomez had encountered that entity long before I did. I was a short-term household staff member in Bel Air. I wasn't even registered. Think of me as a backup employee. Rumors about shadow areas in certain parts of the house always circulated. At first, I didn't care. In Los Angeles, everyone tells a story. Everyone has a secret. Every house has a darkness. But the silence I heard in Selena's house wasn't real silence. It was a deep pressure. It was the presence of something breathing without showing itself. The first night I came on shift, the house seemed extraordinarily calm. But underneath the silence was a sense of danger that vibrated. Even as I breathed, I felt a slight weight in my chest. A house doesn't make you feel this way. A house can be just a structure, but the walls here seemed to be listening. As I took my steps, there was no echo. My footsteps disappeared. Even that wasn't normal. I noticed this within the first hour of entering. Something was wandering somewhere inside the house. I couldn't see it, but it was impossible not to notice. A strange cold draft passed through door cracks, sometimes touching my shoulder. It wasn't something that would come from air conditioning. Even the smell of the air changed, like a dark basement smell, a scent between earth and mold. Selena was away from the media at that time, spending more time at home. Everyone said she was depressed, but I was an employee. I minded my own business, but every time I heard Selena's footsteps in the house, I became uneasy. There was something strange about her footsteps. It was as if something was constantly watching her and she was aware of it. Everywhere she stepped, the air got a little colder. My first encounter happened at 3 in the morning. I had turned off the lights and gone out to check the hallway. At the end of the corridor, in the shadow of the stairs, there was something. I thought my eyes were deceiving me. But this wasn't a shadow. Shadows are dark, but they stay still. This was moving. It was undulating. It seemed to be breathing. I wanted to pull my steps back, but my feet wouldn't obey me. My body froze. The entity looked at me. There were no eyes, but there was a sense of gaze. An intense pressure formed in my body. My heart raced. My throat went dry. This feeling had never happened to me before. It was as if a 1,000-pound weight was pressing on my entire body all at once. And then something happened. The entity started walking toward me. There was no sound of footsteps, but its movement was very clear. As it approached, the darkness intensified. It had no arms, but it had a shape. It was in human form, but it wasn't human. It's very hard to describe it as I saw it in that moment. It was like smoke, but seemed to have a solid structure. And it was coming toward me. I couldn't move. I was even holding my breath. Right at that moment, a door slammed shut upstairs. The entity suddenly stopped. It turned its head, or that dark area resembling a head, toward the door. The silence grew heavier. Then the entity retreated. As it pulled back, its body dispersed like a thin fog tunnel and gathered again. Then it disappeared toward the back of the staircase. I collapsed where I was standing. My legs wouldn't carry me. At that moment, I realized this. What I saw in this house wasn't just an apparition. This entity was alive. It had a purpose. And it was roaming Selena's house. It was watching her. Maybe it had chosen her before me. That night, I couldn't leave the house out of fear. I waited for morning to come. But even when daylight came, the cold inside me didn't go away. It was as if the entity had marked me. At that moment, I made a decision. If I didn't tell someone what I saw, I would lose my mind. But if I told, maybe others before me would say they saw it too. Maybe a secret was being kept in this house, and that secret was about to swallow me whole. As the air inside the house grew heavier that night, I found myself constantly listening to the hallways. It was as if something was moving inside the walls. It wasn't breathing, but it made its presence felt through its movements. After that first shadow moment I experienced at the entrance, I realized this house in Bel Air wasn't an ordinary house. The feeling growing inside me was that I wasn't just in a house, but in some kind of waiting room. It was as if something had seen me and was watching for the right moment to return. Selena was still in her room at this part of the night. Her light was off. Even thinking that she was asleep gave a strange sense of relief, because at least I wasn't alone. But at the same time, the possibility that something could happen to her made me uneasy. This heaviness roaming the house seemed to be watching not just me, but her too. When I stood at the top of the stairs and looked at the shadows in the hallway, I got the feeling that if I took one step, that entity would also take a step. It was that close. When I decided to go down the stairs, my feet trembled involuntarily. At each step, the house's creaking took on a different tone. It wasn't a normal wooden sound. It was as if beneath my steps there was something breathing, not wood. I forced myself to find a logical explanation for this, but my mind wouldn't accept it. This house was alive, or rather, there was something else living inside this house. When I got down to the ground floor, I looked outside through the huge windows in the living room. The Bel Air streets were silent, but even within that silence, I continued to hear the humming inside the house. There was no wind. There was no car noise. The night was completely still, but this stillness didn't give me peace. It gave me a sense of approaching danger. The moment I took a step, I heard a rustle from the dark corner on the right. It was very faint, but the human ear recognizes certain sounds. This was the sound of feet dragging, a heavy and cautious movement. It was as if someone who hadn't walked in a long time was advancing, dragging their body. My breath caught. If I tried to speak, I wouldn't even have a voice. This entity wasn't just watching me. It was coming toward me. At that moment, I realized what I felt at the entrance wasn't a momentary shadow. It was a warning. The darkness in this house didn't want to be known, but it had chosen me. Maybe I had entered through the wrong door at the wrong time, or maybe what drew me here was this darkness itself. And at that moment, for the first time, I felt that this shadow entity wasn't just a stranger. It was a stalker, something that had chosen me. The longer I stayed here, the closer it would get. As I walked towards Selena's door, my heart rate had increased noticeably, because this story was just beginning. The darkness in this house wasn't just watching me. It was measuring my breath and waiting. I knew the moment when this waiting would end was very near. As I approached Selena's door, there was no sound coming from inside. This silence didn't comfort me. On the contrary, it was a silence similar to that rustle I heard on the lower floor of the house. A silence that waited, measured, and watched. I stood in front of the door and tried to steady my breath. When my hand reached for the doorknob to go in, the air inside the house changed sharply. It was as if the hallway behind me suddenly grew cold. I felt that the wind touching the back of my neck wasn't artificial wind. It was as if someone was standing behind me. I didn't dare open the door. First, I looked back. The hallway was completely dark. It looked as if nothing was there. But that feeling didn't go away. The shadow man had no breath. He had no footsteps. But he had a presence. And that presence wasn't behind the door. It was roaming this hallway right along with me. I cracked the door open to wake Selena. Even though the moonlight wasn't hitting the window, there was a very faint brightness inside. When I saw her curled up in bed, knowing she was at least okay gave me a brief sense of relief. I closed the door without making a sound and turned back. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, a clicking sound came from deep within the house. It was a regular clicking, as rhythmic as a clock but far from natural, very cold and mechanical, like a joint moving, as if something was adjusting its arm or neck. This sound drew me toward the stairs. The bottom part of the staircase was completely dark. When I looked toward it, I couldn't see, but I could feel it. Something that existed was hiding its own shape within the darkness. And this was like a pride in being invisible to the human eye. The clicking sound suddenly stopped. A very faint weight sound was heard from the stair steps, as if someone was there and had pulled back their step. What gave me chills wasn't the movement itself, but the silence that formed after the movement. That silence was telling me this. This entity knew me. It was tracking every step I took, every direction I turned. That shadow wasn't just roaming, it was mapping me. It was watching where I stood inside the house, which door I headed toward, which light I turned my eyes to. I tried to walk toward the window at the far end of the hallway. My feet were heavy, not from fear, but from a pressure. It was as if the house's atmosphere was applying an unknown, forced to keep me from moving. When I approached the window, I looked outside. The bushes at the back of the garden were dark, but among the bushes I saw a shape resembling emptiness. What I call emptiness was actually a void, an area that even darkness didn't accept. And that area was watching me. My body froze, because the shape of that void resembled a human form. It was tall, its shoulders were sunken, and its head was tilted slightly to the side. It was as if it had been waiting for me to approach the window. This time I didn't look away, because I felt that if I did, the likelihood of it appearing behind me was higher. While watching that silhouette in the garden, a very faint whisper was heard from inside the house. I didn't understand what it said, but the voice seemed to belong not to me but to the house itself. It was as if the house was talking to this entity inside it. At that moment I understood, this shadow didn't just belong to the house. The house was breathing with it. The house's structure, its walls, its floors were taking shape according to its presence. It was recording every person who came here. Maybe even Selena wasn't aware. Maybe this entity had been watching her for years, but since it saw me, it wasn't turning its attention elsewhere. When I turned around, the darkness in the hallway was no longer ordinary darkness. Every place I stepped was like a new passage where it waited, and for the first time I realized this. This entity wasn't about Selena. Nothing might have happened to her in the house that night. The real problem was my coming here, because in this house, the target of the night wasn't Selena, it was me. As the darkness of the hallway drew me in, a heaviness formed inside me. I no longer felt that I wasn't alone in the house as a mental possibility, but as a physical reality. The coldness embedded in the walls, the air currents blowing from places where there should be none, and the floor trembling slightly as if it were breathing, told me this. It was as if every point inside the house had been marked by this entity's touch. With every step I took, I felt something moving beneath the floor. It was as if the shadow was mimicking my step and passing through my footprint. I decided to go up the stairs. As I passed by Selena's room, I saw a faint light coming from under the door. Seeing this light created a brief relief inside me, but immediately afterward, a heavier thought formed. That entity wanted me to go upstairs. I could feel it, because when I wanted to head downstairs, my body wouldn't move at all. It was as if the shadow had put weight on my muscles. I had to go up. The impulse inside me was telling me this. As I climbed the stairs, the steps made a lighter creak than normal. This creak was an organic sound. It resembled not the wood but a tremor produced by something's breath. When I reached the middle of the steps, a wave of air rose from behind me. It was as if someone hadn't passed quickly, but rather was climbing very slowly from the bottom of the stairs. When this rising cold air touched my legs, my hair stood on end. When I reached the top of the stairs, I turned left. This floor was the old and nearly forgotten section that Selena didn't normally use. At the end of the hallway was a guest room. Its door was half open. The opening of the door was so balanced that this situation seemed like a conscious signal to me. It was as if someone had opened the door and was waiting for me to continue. The moment I stepped inside, the air in the room changed. It was as if someone had been standing here very recently. The curtains were swaying slightly, as if someone had just passed through. The cause of this swaying wasn't wind. The air was completely still. The movement was the passage of an entity inside the room. As I walked into the room, I noticed the large mirror on the wall. The mirror was dust-free. This was the cleanest surface in the house. When I approached, I saw my own reflection, but the image was much darker than normal. Even though my face was lit, the hallway behind me appeared almost pitch black. It was darker than normal. When I tried to look into the darkness, I saw a movement behind me. It was a very small tremor, but it wasn't human. I felt a sharp shiver that started from the back of my head and descended down my spine. When I turned around, there was no one in the hallway, but I had seen the trace of that silhouette in the mirror. A tall shadow, with shoulders lowered, had been standing right behind me. It had no form other than darkness. That entity was using darkness just to exist. It wasn't showing itself directly, only allowing itself in the reflection. This made me more uneasy, because if the shadow didn't want to appear directly, the reason must not be to scare me, but to slowly consume me. When I turned back to the room, I saw that the door was starting to close on its own. The door was closing slowly, with a steady force. There was no wind. There was no slope. This was a conscious movement. I was being trapped in the room. Before the door closed completely, I quickly made a move and grabbed the door. But as I held the door, I felt pressure under my fingers. What was pushing the door wasn't wind, but was like a hand, as cold and controlled as the force of a hand. As I tried to open the door, for a moment I felt the entity's power. This power wasn't being used to kill me, but to watch me. With one last effort, I pushed the door back open. The moment I threw myself into the hallway, the door slammed shut. When I looked back, I saw a small darkening on the door, a shape resembling a fingerprint, tall, thin, and a mark that didn't resemble a human hand. It stood right in the middle of the door. This mark was both a message and a warning. The entity wasn't letting me go. I felt it wouldn't allow me to leave this house. The darkness in the hallway continued to grow heavier. Now, with every step I took, I was living with the shadow. And at that moment, I understood this. The shadow wasn't just watching me. It wanted me to get used to it, because in the rest of the night, a much bigger reason for this would emerge. I turned right to get away from the darkness of the hallway and began moving toward the oldest section of the house. This section consisted of rooms that hadn't been used in years. There were cracks in the walls and the paint had blistered in some places. But the air was heavier compared to the other rooms. With every step I took inside, breathing became harder. It was as if oxygen had given way to something else. It was as if the entity had made this place its own domain. I felt a faint vibration coming from the walls. At first I thought this was just my stress, but the vibration reached all the way to the soles of my feet. When I put my hand on the wall, I felt something moving. This couldn't be an animal. This vibration resembled human breathing, an irregular breath, a deep and dark breath. At the end of the hallway was a small storage room. This room's door stood half open and a dim light was seeping from inside. No light in the house could be this dim. The dimness was like the reflection of a kind of light passing through the entity, not a light bulb. I slowed my steps. As I approached the room, the smell coming from inside became more pronounced. The smell of cold metal and a density reminiscent of an old basement's air. The smell reminded me of something. A hotel cold storage room. The frozen metal shelves I had seen that night. The presence of this smell in the house drove me further into panic. The moment I stepped into the room, the light disappeared. A darkness fell as if someone had flipped a switch. I held my breath until my eyes adjusted to the darkness, because there was someone inside. This entity filled all the air in the room with the weight of its body. It occupied a much larger area than a human. It's hard to describe this feeling, but a person's instinct immediately understands certain things. You can sense the presence of someone standing in the dark, even without seeing them. That's exactly what I experienced at that moment. A gaze without eyes was watching me within the darkness. I tried to take a step, but a shadow wave advanced across the floor and reached beneath my feet. It was cold. It was moving. This shadow flowed like water, but left a physical touch. When the shadow wrapped around my foot, my knees trembled involuntarily. This entity wasn't just controlling darkness. It could also make contact. The shadow's texture was both dense and slippery. It was trying to pull me back. I reached for my phone to find light again. But the moment I picked up the phone, the screen went dark. The phone didn't shut down completely. It was as if someone was holding their finger on the screen and not allowing it to turn on. This was a conscious obstruction. The entity didn't want me to reach the light. When I pulled my hand from my pocket, I felt a coldness that worked its way under my fingernails. This time the entity made not just its shadow felt, but its entire presence. A movement passed by me in that darkness. A friction resembling the contact of a shoulder, but not physical. This contact pushed me toward the floor. When I collapsed to the ground, I saw the shadow changing shape on the floor. A form resembling a human body, but composed entirely of darkness. The spinal line wasn't distinct. The arms were long and unbalanced. The body's weight leaned not on air, but on darkness. When this form approached me, my breath stopped. A pressure fell on my chest. It was as if the entity was pressing my chest and listening to my heart's rhythm. There was a deep humming coming from within the darkness. This humming wasn't a language. It wasn't a sentence, but its meaning was very clear. It knew my witnessing. It knew I was there that night, and it had already begun tracing why I was in this house. At that moment, the room's door slowly opened and the hallway's weak light filtered inside. Through the door opening, the moment the light touched the room, the shadow retreated. It hid itself inside the walls. It didn't move. It made no sound, but it didn't disappear completely. It just waited. It was waiting for me to take one more step and get a little closer to its world. When I threw myself outside, I was out of breath. When I tried to close the door was pushed back. This time the entity wasn't allowing me to close the door, because if the door closed, it would remain inside. But if it stayed open, it could follow me. Understanding that the door was moving according to the entity's intention settled inside me like a cold wall. As I stood in the middle of the hallway trying to catch my breath, something else happened. All the lights flickered at once. Then they all went out at the same time. The house fell silent. The electricity hadn't gone out. The entity had done this knowingly. It had extinguished all the house's light with a single movement, and I was no longer alone. The darkness had completely taken me in. From this point on, escape seemed to cease being an option, because the entity wasn't moving inside the house. It was transforming the house into its own body. Every wall, every shadow, every door was a part of it, and I was just a guest chosen to be watched. And this guest status was serving a much larger purpose. In the next step, I was about to understand what it wanted. Standing in the darkness of the room, I understood. This shadow, this entity, wasn't the house itself. It was measuring the fear, helplessness, and curiosity of everyone who entered here. It wasn't just watching, it was drawing boundaries, showing where it could stand and how far it could go. My steps quietly retreated, but the shadow never moved. It was as if it sensed the fear inside me and was amplifying it. Every breath, every tremble, every blink was a signal for it. Suddenly, I felt the air in the room change. The cold was sharper, the silence deeper. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, but my breath felt like it stayed inside, because as long as it made its presence felt, I couldn't be safe anywhere. An impulse inside me was telling me to leave the house immediately, but my body was frozen. The shadow was there without moving. It was reading my every thought. I saw a light in the doorway. There was an exit, but the entity didn't want to let me go. When I looked back, I could feel the shadow. There was a weight beside it, the presence of an entity. I decided to walk toward it. With each step, my heart raced. I couldn't hear my voice. There was only the echo of my breath. As I descended the final steps, I felt a touch, but it wasn't a touch. It was more like a reminder. It was telling me that I wasn't alone here and that none of my steps would remain hidden. I stepped outside through the door and drew the cold air into my lungs. The shadow hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting for me. Among the city lights, car sounds, and distant sirens, I felt somewhat safe. But I knew if I returned to the house, it would be there again. The entity had begun living not just inside the house, but in my mind as well. That's why I'm telling you. That shadow in Bel Air wasn't just watching Selena. It was choosing all the curious ones, all the witnesses, all the watchers. And if you're watching this video, maybe you're next in line. But don't be afraid. Just be careful. Don't break the house's rules, and get away before the entity chooses you. If you followed this story to the end, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel, because this isn't just a story, it's also a warning. In the next video, we'll take you on an even darker and more unknown journey. Feel the shadow, accept the fear, and be ready to face the truths. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and share your own theories in the comments. Maybe one day your name will also be linked to this shadow. But for now, thank you for watching, and remember, some stories exist only to be watched, not to be joined.